The English have loved Richard the Lionhearted for centuries. Many consider him the ideal English king. He is thought of as a model of chivalry, the ideal Christian king who fought Islamic conquerors of the Holy Land in the Third Crusade, and who fought the evil French on the European mainland. His reputation is helped by an early death at the zenith of his power. However, he has been reevaluated in recent decades, and he is now viewed in a more balanced light. Some revisionist historians even consider him one of the worst English kings. I have long considered Richard and his coinage among the most peculiar in English history. Richard spent 9.5 years of his 10-year reign outside of England, and gave the country very little of his attention. He had coins minted in both England and France. Oddly, his English coins have his portrait, but another king's name on them. His French coins have his name, but not his portrait. In this video, I'll explain what on earth was going on. If you love history like I do, hit the like button, and subscribe now to help this channel grow and bring you more content like this. Richard's father, Henry II, was the son of Matilda, who prevailed against the weak and unpopular King Stephen after 15 years of civil war. It was agreed that Stephen would continue to reign until his death, and that Matilda's son Henry would succeed him as king. This happened in 1154, 3 years before Richard was born. Henry was an energetic king who was constantly on the move within his territory, which included England, as well as large areas in France. He also had a ferocious temper that often caused him problems. Most notably when, during a dispute with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he exploded and wished out loud that someone would rid him of this troublesome priest. 4 of his knights, seeking to win favor, departed for Canterbury and killed Becket as he prayed, an act that scandalized all of Europe and blighted Henry's reputation. Henry's temper gave rise to a legend about Henry's father being the grandson of Satan himself. His temper also destroyed his family. He imprisoned his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and all 4 of his sons rebelled against him at one time or another. At the beginning of Henry's reign, the English coinage was very crudely struck, and compared poorly with the coinage of France and the rest of Europe. In 1180, however, a new coinage was issued that showed a portrait of the king and his name in Latin, Henricus. On the reverse of these coins, there is a small cross inside a circle. Outside of this circle is the name of the mint where the coins were struck and the name of the moneyer who was responsible for their issue. These coins were minted of almost pure silver and became very popular and widely accepted, even outside of England. They are known to collectors today as short cross pennies, after the small cross on the reverse. Richard was born in 1157, but at the time of his birth he was not expected to become king. He had an older brother, also named Henry, who was heir to the throne of England and to the vast territory that Henry II controlled in France. The young Henry contracted dysentery while waging a rebellion against his father. When it became clear to him that he would not survive, the younger Henry did penance for his disloyalty. On his deathbed, he asked to see his father, but King Henry refused to see his dying son. In June 1183, the younger Henry died, making Richard heir to the throne. As heir, Richard rebelled against his father and allied himself with Philip II of France, who saw all of this as an opportunity to weaken King Henry's position. In 1189, the combined forces of Richard and Philip defeated Henry's army at the Battle of Boulons. A few days later, Henry died at the age of 56, thus making Richard king. Richard inherited more territory in France than the King of France himself controlled. This was sure to eventually cause strife between the two. Richard was crowned king at Westminster Abbey in September of 1189. During his coronation, a contingent of Jews arrived with gifts for the new king. But Richard's court officials stripped the Jews and had them flogged. This excited the population of London, who attacked and killed many Jewish people and burned their homes. To his credit, Richard ordered the execution of the ringleaders of these anti-Semitic attacks. In 1187, 2 years before becoming king, Richard took an oath to go on crusade in the Holy Land. In 1188, Jerusalem fell to the great Muslim warrior Saladin, prompting Philip II of France to join Richard in vowing to go on crusade. The two agreed to go to war in the Holy Land together because each suspected that the other might try to conquer his kingdom. In the 12th century, as today, nothing is more expensive than a war. Richard raided the large store of wealth that his father had left behind. He sold land and titles in England and imposed heavy taxes on his people. At one point, Richard was quoted as saying, "I would sell London itself if only I could find a buyer." In the summer of 1190, Richard set out on crusade with Philip, and they were joined by Leopold V of Austria. Richard left his territory in the hands of his younger brother, Prince John. Because the short cross coinage of Henry II was so popular and widely accepted, and his mind was on the crusade and not domestic matters, Richard made no changes to the coins in England, even going so far as to not change the name from Henricus to Ricardus. The coins continued to be carefully struck on well-rounded blanks of fine silver, just as they had under the reign of King Henry. Richard inherited his father's energy and drive, but he focused this energy in an entirely different direction, one that hardly involved England at all. On their way to the Holy Land, Richard and Philip made port first in Sicily and then in Cyprus, both of which they occupied and stripped of ready cash. Before leaving Cyprus, Richard married Berengaria, the daughter of the King of Navarre in what is now northern Spain. Berengaria traveled with Richard briefly before returning to Richard's territory in France. Richard moved on towards the Holy Land, where he arrived in June of 1191. The city of Acre, now known as Acca, fell to the Crusaders shortly after their arrival. Richard was ill during the attack on Acre, but still took part in the campaign. After Acre fell, Richard and Philip raised their banners on the city walls. When Leopold V of Austria raised his banner next to theirs, Richard ordered it torn down and thrown into a ditch, as he felt that Leopold was not his equal. This caused a disgusted Leopold to leave the crusade and return home, something that would later haunt Richard. The English king's health improved, but he began to have disagreements with Philip over who would become king of Jerusalem once they recaptured it. Claiming illness, Philip left the crusade and returned to France. The biggest black spot of Richard's career occurred after the attack on Acre. Richard was in possession of nearly 2,700 Muslim prisoners. Richard believed that it wouldn't be possible for his army to advance with so many prisoners in his custody, so he ordered all of them bound and marched to a nearby hill where they were beheaded. Richard's rival, the Muslim general Saladin, responded by ordering the massacre of 1,600 Christian hostages that he held in Damascus. Many of the Christian crusaders disapproved of Richard's killing of hostages. Many contemporary Muslim religious scholars condemned Saladin's massacre of innocent prisoners as well. In June 1192, the Crusaders advanced to within sight of Jerusalem, but were forced to withdraw due to arguments among their leaders. Richard grew increasingly worried that his brother John and Philip II of France were plotting against him, which was not an unfounded concern. At the same time, Saladin's forces were suffering from low morale due to repeated defeats. Both sides were ready to look for a way out. They reached an agreement that called on the Crusaders to dismantle their military fortifications, in exchange for Saladin allowing access to Jerusalem by Christian pilgrims and European merchants, and granting a 3-year truce. With this settled, Richard departed the Holy Land in October 1192. Richard had intended to sail back to England, but bad weather forced his ship into port on one of the Greek islands in territory belonging to the Byzantine Empire. Richard was on bad terms with the Byzantine Emperor Isaac II and did not wish to remain in his territory for long. His party regrouped and set sail again, but continued bad weather caused his ship to wreck on the coast of Italy, forcing him to take an overland route through territory belonging to none other than Leopold V of Austria. Richard and his party disguised themselves as they passed through Austria, but in Vienna their lavish spending and brash behavior drew attention to themselves, and people began to whisper. Finally, on a cold winter's night, a few days before Christmas, Richard was captured. Leopold had him imprisoned at the isolated Castle Dürnstein. Leopold, still smarting from the insult on the walls of Acre, refused to free Richard, who spent his time in prison composing songs, and no doubt regretting his earlier decision to have Leopold's banner thrown into a ditch. In 1193, Leopold sold Richard to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. Henry VI then offered to free Richard in exchange for a payment of 100,000 pounds of silver, which had to be paid in advance. Hearing of this, Prince John and Philip II of France offered to pay 50,000 pounds of silver in exchange for Richard's continued imprisonment, an offer that Henry VI turned down. The stories of Robin Hood and his merry band of thieves who battled the Sheriff of Nottingham and Prince John are set during the era of Richard's captivity. Most of the ransom was paid in early 1194, and on February 4th, Richard was set free. On hearing of this, Philip II wrote a warning to Prince John advising, "Look after yourself, for the devil is loose." With his brother free, all support for John vanished, and when Richard returned to England in March 1194, John threw himself on his brother's mercy. Richard declared that John was a simple child who had been led astray by wicked advisers, despite the fact that the child was 27 years old at the time. Forgiven though he was, Richard took all of John's lands except Ireland. In spite of this, John remained loyal to Richard for the rest of his reign. Richard had himself crowned king a second time and then undertook an invasion of France to punish Philip II. Eventually he defeated Philip, who was forced to flee. Richard captured all of Philip's state papers and important documents. Richard now boasted that he recognized no superior except God. Richard had coins issued in his French territories of Poitou and Aquitaine. These coins bear the king's name, in Latin, Ricardus, but do not show a portrait of the king, which was the custom in France at the time. Instead, they are decorated only with a simple cross, not altogether unlike that seen on the short cross pennies issued in England. These coins were denominated as silver dinars, the French equivalent of the penny, but were struck in silver of much lower fineness than the English coins. Although these coins looked to be of good silver when new, the alloys in them would tone with use, and they came to be known as black money. After all of his military adventures in the Holy Land and France, and his huge ransom, Richard needed cash. For this reason he was interested when he heard rumors that a large hoard of Roman gold coins had been uncovered at a small castle near Limoges. The king advanced on the castle and surrounded it, demanding the treasure be turned over to him, but the castle defenders took up positions on the walls and harassed the English with crossbow shots. It is said that Richard used a frying pan to deflect these shots as he casually dictated orders to his staff. This went on for several days until Richard was hit in the shoulder by a crossbow. At first, the wound did not appear serious, but after several days it became infected, and Richard could slowly feel the life being drained out of him. During this time, the castle fell to Richard's forces, but it was too late for the gold to help him now. On his deathbed, Richard called for the crossbowman to be brought to him. The crossbowman turned out to be a boy named Peter Basile, who told the king that he shot him because he had killed the boy's father and 2 brothers. Richard responded to the boy's courage by granting him 100 shillings in silver coin and telling him to live on and enjoy my gift for the rest of your days. He then ordered the boy to be set free. On 6th April 1199, Richard the Lionhearted died in the arms of his mother at the age of 41, after a reign of 10 years. Richard's body was buried in Anjou, France, the country he considered his home. His heart was removed and buried in Normandy. During the French Revolution, his grave was vandalized, and the whereabouts of his body are unknown. After the king's death, Peter Basile was captured by Richard's followers and skinned alive. Richard was a complex character. He was long regarded as the ideal English king, but he spoke no English and spent little time in England. He used the country mainly as a source of revenue. Despite being born in Oxford, he saw himself as belonging to the culture of France rather than England. He was subject to a fierce temper and at times great cruelty, but he also admired poetry and song. His reputation has ebbed and flowed over the centuries. In his own time, he was regarded as a stern imposer of excessive taxes. In the decades after his death, an aura of greatness grew around him. The Victorians admired him as a Christian warrior king and placed a romanticized statue of him, sword pointed to the sky, outside the Houses of Parliament. One historian said of him, he was a bad son, a bad husband, a bad king, but a gallant and splendid warrior. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe. That way you'll be the first to know when new videos are published. Thank you for watching.